Hey guys, it's Suraw, welcome back. I'm very excited about today's video because we're gonna have a more in-depth look at one of my most favorite VR flight simulators, X-Plane 11 in VR using the Pimax. We're gonna analyze the frame rate and performance, the image quality and the immersion running it on the Pimax 8K and the Pimax 5K Plus wide field of view and high resolution headsets. This video has taken me a few days to finish actually, as I've spent many hours testing the simulator performance, finding tweaks, researching plugins and possible solutions to improve the frame rate numbers in X-Plane 11 in VR while maintaining a high resolution, wide field of view and optimal image quality of course. And while X-Plane 11 being one of the most, if not maybe the most CPU and GPU hungry simulators, it has become a real challenge to find the perfect balance between image quality and performance. In my full Pimax 8K and 5K Plus review a few weeks ago, I did a shorter X-Plane 11 session, giving it a first look running on the Pimax, and many of you probably got quite disappointed about the lack of performance, very low frame rates and visual quality I was not really satisfied with. With frame rates jumping around the 30 mark or sometimes even below is far from optimal, and while I really love this VR simulator and made several videos of it in the past running on the HTC Vive, Oculus Rift and also Samsung Odyssey with quite acceptable performance, I decided it was time to challenge myself and optimize this experience for the Pimax headsets as well. In this video, I will walk you through some of the tweaks and optimizations I have made, and we will take a look at what frame rates we can expect running X-Plane 11 in VR on the Pimax 8K and 5K Plus using a GTX 1080 Ti graphic card with an Intel i7 8700K processor. As a follow-up on this video, I will also do X-Plane 11 VR benchmarks and even more in-depth tweaking in the upcoming weeks, using the RTX 2080 Ti GPU and the Intel i9 9900K 8-core CPU, which I pre-ordered and should arrive very soon. So make sure to subscribe to my channel, and I promise you many more X-Plane 11 and Pimax videos coming up. Before we get started, I would like to give a huge thanks to every one of my Patreon supporters, and a special thanks to my 3 official sponsors, Commander Darklight, Art Armin and VR Ambassador. X-Plane 11 in VR is a tricky simulator, I gotta say. While it runs perfectly smooth on my system in non-VR mode, once you throw the image into a VR headset, the performance starts to suffer. Ever since I started with the X-Plane 11 VR on my Vive, Rift and Odyssey, I have never managed to reach a stable 90 frames per second unless I decrease the visual quality to a rather unacceptable level. Oculus Rift and Samsung Galaxy can indeed make X-Plane run fully smooth thanks to the built-in motion reprojection or asynchronous space warp, which interpolates the rendered frames, affecting not only your head movements in VR like traditional asynchronous reprojection does, but also making everything else that moves in your view fully smooth. You can call it by cheating, but it works surprisingly well and uses much less resources, which also lowers the requirements of a very powerful PC hardware. As for the Pimax headsets, we don't really have this feature implemented yet. The Pimax team is still working on the brain warp technology that is supposed to work the same way as motion reprojection, but as of today, the Pimax 8K and 5K Plus only uses head motion reprojection similar to the Steam VR asynchronous reprojection, and this means even if X-Plane 11 is running in 75 frames per second, it won't really feel silky smooth unless you reach that max refresh rate of your headset, which is in this case 80 Hz for the Pimax 8K and 90 Hz for the Pimax 5K Plus. Your head movements will of course always be smooth, but your surroundings such as the scenery, the buildings, trees and other airplanes may look a little bit stuttery or juddery when you fly past them. Anyways, as we know already, In X-Plane 11, the CPU or the processor unit of your PC is the one taking the biggest hit, much more than the GPU actually. This is not only because X-Plane 11 is an advanced flight simulator with loads of calculation and simulations going on in the background, such as aerodynamics, weather conditions and navigation systems, but also because it's built upon an old engine which is rather old now, only supporting 1 or 2 CPU core utilization. This means your 12 or 18 core processor might not work better than a dual core CPU in X-Plane, and in the end the in-game frame rate and frame times will depend mostly on your processor's single core performance. In other words, the higher clock speeds per core, the better. In my case, I'm using an Intel i7 8700K processor cooled with a Kraken X62 all-in-one water cooling solution, and since a week ago I have managed to overclock this CPU to a stable 5 GHz on all 6 cores, maintaining an acceptable temperature and core volts below 138. I know this might sound extreme and a bit geeky, but believe me, it is necessary for X-Plane 11 in VR, and while I wish I could go even higher, there is also a good reason for me to now upgrade this CPU for the Intel i9 9900K, which apparently should be able to hit 5.3 or even 5.4 GHz core speeds with custom overclocking. How much of that might help in X-Plane 11, it's impossible to say now, but I will for sure let you know about it once my CPU arrives. Besides the current 5 GHz CPU overclocking, my 32 GB of DDR4 RAM memory is running at 3800 MHz with a CAS latency numbers 15, 15, 15, 35, and the GTX 1080 Ti GPU is of course overclocked to the max, boosting above 2 GHz. But there is much more that can be done than just overclocking your system. I made an X-Plane 11 performance boost video in the past, showing you many tweaks you can do on your motherboard BIOS, for example, to free up some resources and increase the frame rates, such as disabling the C states on your CPU, disabling all power management, and even disabling the hyperthreading can help in some cases. Also, the Windows application Process Lasso has some very efficient features which can limit any Windows software, game or process to run only on specific cores of your CPU and spread out the utilization more wisely for better frame rates. But I won't go deeper into this topic now, as I would just repeat myself. If you want to know more about it, check out the X-Plane 11 performance boost video I made a while back, which I added in the video description down here below. Now let's talk about the Pimax software PyTool, and then we're gonna move on to the optimization of the X-Plane 11 software itself. As you know, Pimax 8K and Pimax 5K Plus has 3 different field of view modes: a large field of view mode of 170 degrees, as well as a 150 degrees normal field of view mode, and a small field of view mode of 120 degrees. If you have seen my videos in the past, you know I mostly prefer to use the normal field of view, which is wide enough, not differing much from the large field of view, but still giving an acceptable performance and a huge field of view with great immersion. The small field of view is there for you to choose, of course, and you will gain maybe up to 10 frames per second in X-Plane 11 VR by going from normal to small, but personally I don't think it's worth it, as the normal field of view gives you a much wider wide field of view with more peripheral vision and all its advantages. So normal field of view is what's being used throughout this whole test and video footage. But how about the PyTool render scale value? After several hours of testing, I realized that there is simply no point going higher than PyTool 1.0 for now at least, as the performance really drops as soon as you go from 1.0 to 125. Also, the visual gains you get with the higher resolution renders are rather small, and in X-Plane 11 you can achieve more clarity and less aliasing by using the built-in settings instead, which I will go through in a moment. Therefore, running X-Plane 11 in VR on both Pimax 8K and 5K Plus, I strongly recommend you to keep the PyTool render quality value at 1.0, and the SteamVR super sampling should be kept around 100% or at least not below 80. I have to add though that going below 80% or even below 90% will make the simulator noticeably less sharp for some reason. This is quite strange to me, as I used to do 80% in a lot of other VR simulators and games with Pimax without any noticeable quality difference. As for the other settings in Python, the parallel projection support needs to be enabled for X-Plane 11, as without it you will get a double image crossing your eyes very uncomfortably. The hidden mask option can be disabled though, as it's not needed, so for this video I kept it disabled. If you have an Nvidia graphic card, I can strongly recommend you, just like always when playing VR simulators, to change the power management option in the Nvidia control panel to prefer maximum performance, and also at the bottom of the same page change the pre-rendered frames in virtual reality to 3. This will give you more stable frame rate, slightly lower GPU frame times, and more smooth VR experience with less inconsistent judder and stutters. But there is much more to do before we fire up X-Plane 11 in VR. If you have seen my X-Plane 11 VR performance boost video, as mentioned before, the biggest gains in frame rate are achieved by running a few plugins made for X-Plane. I know there is a whole bunch of different plugins to choose from, mostly made by the very active community members. Unfortunately, many of these plugins and tweaks are not possible to mix with each other, so you need to pick the most efficient one and stick with it. The one I have found been working the best during the last days testing X-Plane 11 with Pimax, increasing the frame rate by 5, 10 or even 20 or sometimes up to 30 frames per second more, is the 3G FPS Wizard 11 plugin. This plugin is modified and improved version based on the previous 3G FPS control plugin made by the same guy named Jörn, as far as I know at least, and it's specifically optimized for version 11 of X-Plane and especially for the VR mode. Basically, what 3G FPS Wizard 11 does is that it adapts and adjusts all the individual image quality settings and options in real time while flying, depending on the performance already achieved and based on your needs that you customize in the plugin settings. You can customize almost everything in the plugin, choose minimal preferred frame rate and which settings should be affected and how much, of course. I will go a little bit more in detail into this in a moment and show you all the available options. The 3G FPS Wizard 11 also requires Fly with Lua script engine to be installed in your X-Plane 11 directory, specifically the latest version made for X-Plane 11. Both these are free of course and available for download from the official X-Plane 11 forums, and you will find the links to the files and its official pages in the video description down here below, just like always. I will not go into details on how you install the script and the plugin and how you enable it in X-Plane, as it's a very straightforward procedure made in a few seconds only, and all step-by-step tutorials are well explained in the links provided in the video description, as already mentioned. But make sure to not install the old versions of the script or plugin, which I used in my old X-Plane 11 performance boost video, as these old versions are no longer supported with the latest X-Plane 11 version updates. We will get back to the script and plugin in a moment, but first let's fire up X-Plane 11 in VR on the Pimax and check out the in-game settings recommended based on my conclusions doing all these tests. The graphics tab in the settings includes a whole bunch of options, and some of them have a huge impact on performance, and while most of these options have also a big impact on visual quality as well, it's quite important for you to try to find the best balance depending on how picky you are with the graphics and how much you expect from the visual side playing X-Plane 11 in VR on the Pimax. It is all individual of course, and while my setting works perfectly fine for me and my needs, I'm sure some of you may have your own recommendations and conclusions based on your preferences. The difference if you play X-Plane 11 on a monitor or in VR is huge. I guess most traditional PC monitor simmers can crank up the settings to max and still maintain a good frame rate, but X-Plane 11 in VR, especially on Pimax, requires high resolutions and low frame times, and it's much more demanding than you may think, so it's kind of a totally different story here. And low quality profile in X-Plane 11 VR does not necessarily mean it looks much worse on the high quality profile you are running on your PC monitor. In my opinion, you cannot really compare these two ways of playing X-Plane 11 on a PC monitor and VR. They're totally different things. The level of quality you will use also depends a lot on the PC hardware you're running, of course. And remember that in my case, I'm using a very powerful PC, so don't get surprised if you need to lower down some of these settings if you have a slower GPU or a CPU, for example, and especially if you don't do any overclocking. So here we go. After many hours of testing and tweaking, I have realized that the visual effects slider set to medium is the way to go here with Pimax to maintain the great image quality overall without killing the performance too much. Setting it to high will give you some extras such as HDR and other anti-aliasing options such as FXAA and SMAA, but I would say it's not worth it as you will lose a lot of frames per second frame rate by doing so, sometimes more than 30%, and for some reason it won't even look better. I will show you an example comparison in action later on in this video. Setting it a step lower than normal or medium may give you a good boost between 5 and even 15 frames per second actually, but I think X-Plane 11 also becomes less appealing and more boring looking. In my test, I'm staying at medium throughout this video, except for when I'm doing the comparison, which I will show you later. The texture quality slider will improve the texture resolution and lower the compression of textures, and the performance hit depends a lot on your GPU. A GTX 1080 Ti as my graphic card has 11GB of VRAM memory, so in theory I could leave it on maximum or even uncompressed. But during several flights in this video, I'm using custom scenery packages, especially in San Francisco and New York City, with bigger and more demanding textures already, and having this option on maximum might max out the GPU memory quite fast, leading to stutters and lower performance, so in this video I will mainly be using high for textures. If you wonder what custom sceneries I'm using in this video, is the free to download packages KSFO San Francisco International Airport and City made by Mr. X and the New York City XP and New York Airports XP, which are available for purchase from the official X-Plane online store. I also use some Ortho 4 XP custom scenery around Las Vegas and Nevada, as well as HD Mesh scenery version 4. Moving on with the settings, the anti-aliasing slider is a very important one here, and yes, it will affect the performance the higher you go. But I would say the performance hit is not that big after all, and I think the difference going from the default value of 1 to value 4 gives a massive visual quality increasement. On anti-aliasing at level 4, you basically get rid of most shimmer on distance and in horizon, and you will almost see no aliasing at all on buildings and around the scenery on distance. On the Pimax 8K and the 5K Plus, running X-Plane 11 VR with Python render quality slider at 1.0 and SteamVR super sampling at 100% as I'm doing in this video, going without any anti-aliasing will give you lots of aliasing and shimmer on distance and in the horizon, and I would strongly recommend you to go with at least AA value of 2 to smoothen it out. And personally, the value 4 feels much more optimal here. Going even higher up to 8 completely removes the aliasing, but it also starts to make the image less sharp, I would say, so stick with 4 if you ask me. Again, changing the visual quality slider to high, you will get access to some other anti-aliasing options such as FXAA and SMAA combinations, but believe me, they won't look better in VR and they are much more demanding, and I will show you that in a moment. The small checkbox with draw shadows on scenery is disabled for this test, as I think yes, it looks better with shadows on, but it's definitely not worth it in terms of performance hit. The number of world objects is one of the most GPU and CPU demanding options available here, and it will dramatically decrease the frame rate the higher you go, of course, at least when you fly around bigger cities or custom sceneries. In most cases, I leave this option on normal, especially in New York with the custom scenery, but around San Francisco area, also with the custom scenery, I had it on low most of the time as normal was just too heavy for my PC and the frame drops was just too big. I would say start off with normal and see if your PC can handle it. Remember that some custom sceneries does require the option to be left at normal at least, otherwise the scenery won't even render the custom buildings or airport facilities. The reflection detail is set to lowest possible, which is minimal. I simply don't think reflections are worth the huge performance decrease, and the draw parked aircraft is kept enabled as it makes the airports look a little bit more alive and most of the time won't affect the frame rate that much as long as you don't use any very complex custom scenery. All the other options are kept untouched here, as most of them don't affect VR mode, and by looking at the VR hardware tab, you will see that I actually disabled the VR mouse cursor. For some reason, the VR mouse enabled is lowering the frame rate noticeably, and while I use the Vive controllers to interact with everything in the cockpit, I do not need to use the mouse at all while flying. And talking about VR controllers, there is one very strange thing here about it when using the Pimax headset with Vive controllers in X-Plane 11 that I have never seen before using the Vive or Rift or any other headset. First time you start up X-Plane 11 with Pimax, you will need to map each of the Vive VR controller buttons, including grip button, menu button, the trigger, and the touchpad X and Y axis. I don't remember doing this ever before when I was playing X-Plane 11 on HTC Vive or the Rift or the Samsung Odyssey. The Vive VR controller simply does not work by default in X-Plane 11, at least not when using Pimax 8K or the 5K Plus, except for the trigger buttons, which works from start. Luckily, mapping all the buttons isn't a very easy task to do, as both controllers are selectable in the device drop-down menu, and you clearly see which of the button is pressed while you are in the menu. You can basically bind any command or action to the VR controller buttons individually for each controller also, which is quite a nice feature actually after all. And once it's done, it will be saved as default and you won't need to do it again unless you uninstall and install a clean X-Plane 11 install in the future. Now we're getting there. Let's jump into the Cessna Skyhawk around San Francisco International with the custom scenery having the recommended settings applied, and let's have a look at the desktop view instead, showing how the 3G FPS Wizard 11 plugin looks and works in real time. As you can see, I have also included a window on the top left side with frame rate, frame times and real-time statistics and graphs using the FPS VR application you can find on Steam. On the lower left side, I'm using another application to show you the total CPU load and also the CPU core temperature provided by the Kraken X62 CPU water cooling kit I use. The 3G FPS Wizard 11 plugin is the blue window in the middle up on the mirrored VR image window. Here you can also see real-time frame rates, frame times and much more. You can either tweak the performance improvements on your own by using the built-in wizard or the advanced mode, or leave it just on auto to let the plugin do the job as good as it can. There is also a max FPS and max quality button, which makes it possible to access the highest versus the lowest possible improvements based on how you have customized all these options in the plugin during the wizard or the advanced tab. Well, anyway, I think it would take too much of the time in this video to show you everything here and explain all of the options and tweaks, as well as how everything works in this plugin, but I can at least show you my own customized values. There are plenty of tutorials going deep into this topic online, and a good one is added in the video description down here below. Under the Advanced tab, you can adjust the maximum and minimum preferred frame rate the plugin should aim for, and even if it's not possible to maintain 90 stable refresh rate, I still put the max value at 90 and minimum around 70 frames per second, because I want the plugin to constantly try to keep an optimal frame rate without any big dips by adding more details than necessary. There are dozens of options to customize here. You can adjust the range of level of detail, visible objects in the scenery, minimum and maximum cloud density, enable automatic anti-aliasing adjuster, and much more. All in all, the 3G FPS Wizard 11 does an excellent job here by adjusting all the values in real time, giving you a much more stable frame rate, but also a very good frame rate boost overall without making the visual noticeably worse. I could not find any value that reduces the image quality too low actually, which is quite good I think. For me the frame rate is really important, but I still want X-Plane 11 to look as beautiful as possible, and I have to say it really does look beautiful. I think this must be said once for all. X-Plane 11 in VR has never felt so gorgeous before as now, running it on the Pimax 8K and the 5K Plus headsets. The lower screen door effect, the better resolution, very sharp image, the wide field of view which is 150 degrees in normal mode, the great looking colors and almost no jaggies and shimmer whatsoever, nor on the cockpit, nor on the distance. All this makes this a truly stunning VR experience every time. I must say this is the most beautiful and immersive VR simulator, hands down. As you may know, I'm a big fan of DCS World, or the Digital Combat Simulator, and while DCS really looks great indeed, I have to admit that there's something with the X-Plane 11 graphics that makes it just look more realistic looking, quite crazy realistic to be honest. The first time I jumped into the MD-80 and saw the huge cockpit in wide field of view and the high resolution, I got blown away. I'm not kidding guys, the high level of detail in everything here, the high resolution, the sharpness and the feeling of actually sitting in that cockpit just gave me a genuine wow moment. I don't feel that often otherwise. I somehow completely forgot that I was even recording this. It was kind of a wank off moment, and I think every real flight simulator fan knows what I'm talking about here. It's crazy. Doing a flight over New York City with low altitude in the sunset, diving under the bridges and doing fast flyby by the Statue of Liberty almost gave me goosebumps. The flight simulators has really come far in the terms of immersion lately, but now in VR, with the wide field of view of Pimax, X-Plane 11 is becoming almost too realistic I think, and you won't understand it until you try it for yourself. But anyways, enough about that now, let's talk more about the performance. Note that every FPS number you have seen so far in this video is recorded after applying all the tweaks, settings and plugins I just recommended. What you see is simply what you get, a quite stable frame rate, most ranging between 45 and 65 frames per second, and I would say the average frame rate is somewhere between 50 and 55 frames per second, which really is not bad at all, having in mind we are rendering X-Plane in 150 degrees field of view and quite high resolution overall, much higher than the HTC Vive Pro renders without additional super sampling. Also, I have to add the fact that I was recording all this footage in real time on the same PC, which of course uses some resources of your CPU, but mainly of the GPU, as I used NVE and C hardware decoding for this video using OBS Studio. And whenever I stop the recordings, I gain another 3 to 5 frames per second more. This means upon every frame rate you see in this video, you should add another 4 or 5 frames per second on average to get a real number when using an overclocked GTX 1080 Ti, an Intel i7 8700K processor at 5 GHz and DDR4 memory at 3800 MHz. We can clearly see that the CPU frame times are much higher than the GPU frame times, which proves the fact that this simulator is much more dependent on a fast CPU rather than a fast GPU, and while using the 8700K at 5 GHz, it's still becoming the bottleneck in my system. Therefore, I'm not really sure how much my upcoming RTX 2080 Ti might help in X-Plane 11, but my pre-ordered Intel i9 9900K processor should definitely make a difference as long as I can overclock it to 5.3 GHz per core or maybe even more. Still, running X-Plane 11 in 50 frames per second on average in VR is not a bad experience at all. I would say it's quite a pleasant experience. It might not be fully smooth, but it never feels stuttery and the minor judder doesn't really bother me that much, especially when flying at higher altitude. It's barely noticeable. And yes, the frame rates will differ a lot depending on how high or low you fly, how complex the scenery is, and of course a big city as New York City with custom scenery textures and models is an extreme example here. If you fly above default scenery and don't dive below maybe 100 feet, you will hardly feel the frame rate not being enough. In this video, I picked some of the more demanding areas such as San Francisco, New York and Las Vegas just to show you how low we can go in the worst case scenario. But still, even above New York, the frame rate never felt like a problem anymore. Also, we have been talking a lot about the in-game settings that I recommended for you, and now I would like to give you an comparison and how the frame rate is affected by changing the anti-aliasing value, switch to the HDR mode, adding more buildings to the scenery and also increasing the texture size to maximum value. Currently, we're flying above San Francisco area on our way from San Francisco International Airport heading down to the city center. I'm having my recommended settings used right now with medium visual effects, textures at medium, anti-aliasing at 4 and world objects at low. We're holding a frame rate between 50 and 52 frames per second. Now let's lower the anti-aliasing to value 1 only and see how much it affects the frame rate and the visuals. As you can see straight away, we have now some major aliasing on the ground level at far distance, where streets and buildings and all the outlines of objects including the horizon is just very jaggy and shimmery because of the aliasing. The rendered image of the X-Plane 11 just looks much worse now, and even the cockpit feels more jaggy. We gained between 8 to 10 more frames per second now, as we now are hovering around 60 frames per second in average, but I would say this is not worth it. The image is just so shimmery, it almost becomes frustrating. Now let's try anti-aliasing at level 2. The image is now much less shimmery, but aliasing is still very visible in the horizon and at ground level around all the details. Cockpit looks better now, but still not so polished as it was with anti-aliasing value at 4. We drop back to 55 or 56 frames per second on average. As you can see, the frame rate decreases a little bit as soon as we unpause the simulation, as X-Plane 11 needs less resources while it's paused. Now we are also moving closer to the city area, which of course is more CPU demanding. Now let's pause again and try anti-aliasing at value 4 again. Now the jagged edges and aliasing is almost completely gone in the horizon and at the ground level around all the city scenery. It looks truly much better in VR, and the cockpit is just much sharper now. Surprisingly enough, we only lost a few frames per second here, going from anti-aliasing 2 to anti-aliasing 4, and now we're gonna try anti-aliasing at level 8. At level 8, we have simply no jagged edges at all anymore, no aliasing at all, and everything looks extremely stable both on the ground, in the horizon, and everywhere I look. I must say that the cockpit gauges though feels a little bit less sharp than anti-aliasing 4, so it looks like the value of 8 is a bit too much after all. Frame rate wise, we are down to between 48 and 50 frames per second, which is not bad at all, but I would say the visual difference is minimal and value 4 feels much more like a balanced option in this case. Now let's jump into the options again and pick anti-aliasing value 4 once again, and you can probably see what I mean. You may still see some slight aliasing right in the middle of the part of the picture, but in VR it's really not noticeable unless you start to look for it. Note again that the frame rate is dropping a bit the more we get closer to the city area. But let's do some more comparisons here. Let's move the visual effects slider to high this time with HDR mode, with anti-aliasing at 2x SSAA plus FXAA, and as you can see, we have dropped more than 5 frames per second now, and interestingly enough, everything looks more blurry with more jagged edges, which are more apparent again. HDR might add some more natural look to the overall image, but the jaggies and aliasing is quite distracting again, really not worth the frame drop here. But how about keeping the HDR enabled and adding more anti-aliasing running 4x SSAA? Now we're down to almost 30 frames per second in frame rate, and we have dropped around 10 frames more. The GPU frame times are really bad now, and I would say I still see some more jagginess and more apparent aliasing now compared to running without HDR and with normal anti-aliasing at 4. Now let's go back to our recommended settings with visual effects at normal and anti-aliasing at 4, but we're gonna increase the texture quality to maximum and also increase the number of world objects to medium and see how it affects the frame rate in a big city such as San Francisco with custom scenery. Interesting, we're back to the frame rates above 40 with an average of around 45, and it actually is fully playable. The GPU frame times are still good and the GPU utilization has decreased from mid-80s to mid-60s. This is actually fully acceptable frame rate as long as it stays above 40 and preferably on 45. The further away we move from the city area, the higher frame rates we get, of course, but I guess you get my point here. Running X-Plane 11 at visual quality on high is just not worth it, and everything works and even looks better on normal without HDR. Now let's keep the texture quality on maximum and bring down the number of world objects to low again, just how we started. We suddenly see a very good frame rate averaging of around 55, so texture detail doesn't really affect the performance much at all, at least not with a GTX 1080 Ti graphic card. So basically, this is how I've spent many hours on testing the performance by switching between different in-game settings, but also adjusting the 3G FPS Wizard 11 custom settings. I hope this gives you an idea at least on how X-Plane 11 runs and performs in VR using the Pimax headsets. And let's not forget about adding the 4 extra frames per second that we're using when we're recording everything with OBS Studio. The recordings are lowering the frame rate of around 3 to 5 frames per second, so add 4 more frames to whatever numbers you see here. So as I already said before, X-Plane 11 is very playable and runs fully acceptable on the Pimax headsets as long as you have a PC powerful enough. And a GTX 1080 Ti and an Intel i7-8700K processor is a setup that many VR simmers have already for sure, but don't forget to squeeze out the lost frames by overclocking everything as much as you can and also do all the recommended stuff mentioned in this video. Lastly, you may wonder which headset performs the best in X-Plane 11, right? The Pimax 8K or the 5K Plus? Well, this time I would say it's a tie. Running with all the settings provided, we are getting rid of most of all the aliasing already, so you won't see any aliasing on any of these headsets. You may know already that jagged edges are often more visible on the Pimax 8K due to the nature of the Pimax render pipeline and the fact that the 8K is upscaling the image from 4040p to 4K while the 5K Plus renders the image natively. The 5K Plus often renders a more sharp image with less aliasing and more clarity, but in X-Plane 11 VR I can really not see the difference. I see a slight difference in clarity maybe, where the cockpit gauges looks a little bit more sharp on the 5K, but looking outside on the scenery, on the ground, on the clouds and buildings and everything else, I really cannot find any flaws on any of these two Pimax headsets. The screen door effect is slightly better on the 8K, just as always, but that's nothing you will ever notice unless you start to stare up in the blue sky, and unless you fly at night, you won't see the slight difference in black levels and contrast where the 8K takes the edge. I would say both the Pimax 8K and the 5K Plus are the winners here today. X-Plane 11 really looks stunning on both, more beautiful than ever before and definitely better than it did on my Samsung Odyssey VR headset. Now add also the fact that we're running all this with a 150-degree wide field of view and a huge sweet spot that covers most of your view, and you may understand why I love the combination of Pimax and X-Plane 11. This testing session has really made me an X-Plane addict again, and I will definitely spend more time tweaking the settings to increase the frame rates even further by finding new plugins and tweaks. In a week or so, I will also get the new RTX 2080 Ti coming in, and around that time I will also get the Intel i9-9900K processor, so I am very excited, and I promise you that I will do more of these videos about X-Plane 11 and Pimax, and of course many other videos of the other VR simulators running on the new hardware as well. So stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and leave a like on this video if you found it interesting. If you appreciate my work and content, please consider supporting me on Patreon, and I will highly appreciate your help. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and please let me know if you have any kind of tips or hints to share regarding performance improvements in X-Plane 11 in VR. Big thanks to all my lovely Patreon supporters just like always, and a special thanks and big hugs to my official sponsors on Patreon, Commander Darklight, Art Armin and VR Ambassador. Have a lovely weekend now and see you very soon again. Cheers!